How did you fall in love with Postgres so much, or maybe like why are so many people falling in love? Why is it so popular? All these years later,
it just works. It's a really good database that just does 80-90% of everything I want it to correctly, and I don't have to worry about it.
If you could invest in one company that's not the company you work for, what would it be?
I want to find the companies that are not using this shiny new database that came out last year, that are using Postgres, that are using Tailwind and Django or Rails. And like, that's your tech stack. Like, that's how I'm going to invest.
Which person influenced you the most in your career? Hey folks, this is Alex. Today's episode is with Craig Kerstiens, who, when I think of Postgres, that's who I think of, right? He's just been in the Postgres space for a long time. First at Heroku, doing Heroku Postgres, then at Citus, doing Distributed Postgres, now at Crunchy Data. He's Chief Product Officer there. He's done a lot of Postgres advocacy and just a lot of interesting stuff. And I want to do a whole series on Postgres this year. This is the first episode where we'll talk about the Postgres ecosystem, some of the Postgres features, some of the naysayers about Postgres, and just get Craig's thoughts on those. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you will as well. If you have any comments, feel free to reach out to me, to my co-host Sean Faulkner. If you want comments on the show, on the series, on anything we can do here at Software Huddle, feel free to reach out. With that said, let's get to the show. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited to have you on because I want to do a whole series on Postgres this year, because I feel like, when I got into tech, Postgres was super hot, and somehow, like all these years later, it's still super hot. Like it won Database of the Year again from dbengines.com, which is the fourth time in 7 years, which is really interesting. So I think there's no one better to talk about Postgres, the whole Postgres ecosystem, all that stuff than you. So maybe to help folks understand why, could you give a little bit on your background, what you're doing, where you've come from, things like that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on where I'm at now, and then kind of back way up, because I think there's some kind of interesting history there. So I'm currently at Crunchy Data. We're kind of everything Postgres. I think when I joined, we would say we were like the red hat of Postgres, do a lot of on-premise support Postgres. I came on board to run product and engineering and help build out Crunchy Bridge, which we'll probably get into at some point, which is, I kind of joke that it's unfinished business from my Heroku days. Heroku was very early on in the database as a service landscape, and it was. We'll probably get into it a little bit more, but I'll back way up, right? So I came on board to Crunchy about 3 years ago. If you need Postgres, come talk to us. We'd love to talk to you. But if I go way back, shortly after college, came out to the Bay Area. I'm originally from Alabama. There's not a lot of high-tech startup scene there. There's a lot of defense, like NASA and defense work, but was kind of interested in the startup world, came out to the Bay Area. I started at Accenture, doing kind of consulting and research stuff. Ended up at Treviso. Treviso, this was 15, 16 years ago? And it was at the time known as CEP, Complex Events Processing. We forked Postgres to turn it into a streaming MapReduce database as data came in. And I think we actually had MySpace as a customer. Like this was when huge, crazy volumes of data, fascinating tech, kind of before its time. Open source wasn't a thing. Postgres wasn't a thing. Did a few things and ended up at Heroku. And when I joined Heroku, I was actually joined to launch their Python support. I'm not a Rubyist. I'm one of the few non-Ruby people from Heroku. And we were running Postgres, and one of the GM of the Postgres team came over to me and was like, hey, you keep doing all this blogging about Postgres. How about you come do marketing? I'm like, I know marketing people are sleazy, right? That's what we think of them as developers. And he ended up convincing me, and I ended up kind of running product and product marketing and all of that for, mostly product for Heroku Postgres. And if we go back to the Heroku Postgres origin story, it was, we had all these Rails developers asking for a database and thought, how hard could this be? RDS didn't exist yet. No RDS. Rails developers wanted a database. We picked Postgres, and years later, I have the email from the GM of RDS saying, you're the reason we launched Postgres. Thank you, Heroku, because we had all these, we got so tired of listening to our customers talk about how they don't want MySQL and they wanted Postgres. Went from Heroku over to Citus, which turned Postgres into a sharded distributed database. They were acquired by Microsoft, for running all of Azure Postgres. It's funny. I actually think of myself as like a DevTools person more than a database person. Like most of the internet's like, oh, Craig, Postgres. But like, let's go talk like build packs and deployment processes and pipe. Like I'll spend much time on that as Postgres, but also it's a really good database. And so I've kind of been pegged as the Postgres person just by like championing it for being a great database and for what it is.
Yep, absolutely. And I remember like that's how I ran into like my first programming experience was like Python, Django apps on Heroku, using Postgres, like reading your stuff and just like fall in love with it and just be like, okay, this is awesome. So yeah, I greatly appreciate all that sort of stuff. I guess like how did you fall in love with Postgres so much, or maybe like why are so many people falling in love? Why is it so popular? All these years later,
it just works. Like it's so like it's just like, oh, I want to like write a report. I can write all of this in Python or Ruby or whatever and extract my data, and like an hour later I get a report. Or I can actually just write some SQL, right? Like it's, for a long time, I thought developers really should love SQL and appreciate SQL. And I've kind of given up on that battle. Like maybe I'm wrong, but like the idea of like window functions or CTEs, or like when I got deep into Postgres, it was really around 8.4 when like CTEs and window functions came in. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I can write this report that does this. And it's so fast and efficient and all of that. And I spent so much of my time at Heroku, just not even externally, internally. Like I was yelling at our developers of like, why are you writing this active record stuff that like generates this query when you could just write SQL? And I recall in actually one of my interviews at Heroku, they were like, well, how would you generate this report that does this? And I just kind of wrote like SQL pseudocode, and they're like, oh my goodness, like what is this black magic stuff? And I don't think as a developer you have to be afraid from it. Like that's the thing that I think like development communities have really come around to, is like I don't have to be terrified of my database. It doesn't have to be. It's so funny because engineers by nature we're learners, right? We're curious. Like let me talk to you about how like clear ice is made, and you're like, huh, that's like every engineer has some weird hobby, right? That it's like the learning part. Databases, though, it's like we don't want to touch them. It's like, no, we don't want to go that crazy. We're not actually a masochist and want to go into like how databases work. But it's a really good database that just does 80-90% of everything I want it to correctly, and I don't have to worry about it.
Yep. It is surprising to me how limited people or as developers don't spend that much time just figuring out basics on like database and like performance and realizing how much you can actually do in a database compared to just doing it in your application code. Or just like how basic indexing works. It surprises me how like fairly senior devs like still don't understand that as well as I think they should. So that's super interesting. I think it's interesting that you think of yourself as a developer, tinkerer, dev tools type guy, because like when I was talking to Sam Lambert, from Planet Scale, my SQL guy, I'm pretty sure he said, developers love Postgres, operators love MySQL. Does that map at all to you? Do you think that you agree on that, or have any thoughts on that?
It's a loaded one because it's so funny. If you look in like the Ruby on Rails community, like I just came back from Rails World a few months ago, and man, it felt like the Rails community is like vibrant and popping. And there were like 3 talks on MySQL, and the 2 biggest like Rails apps, or 3, Basecamp, I think Shopify and GitHub are all MySQL. Everyone else in that ecosystem is Postgres. And so I think you get like an outspoken voice from the like couple of huge, massive scale. And it's like, oh, Postgres doesn't work at this scale. Uber's a great example where they're like, look, we migrated away from Postgres to MySQL. What's covered up is like before that, they migrated from MySQL to Postgres. And they had a new VP of engineering come in that said, I don't like Postgres, let's migrate away. And that's the entire, like, could Postgres, like, are there flaws with Postgres? Sure. Are there flaws with MySQL? Absolutely. I would not overgloss and say, like, operators love one versus the other.
And I think some of those things, I want to talk about some of those later too, but I think some of those things have gotten better over the like replication and some of the things like that in Postgres to like where that operational stuff with Postgres has gotten a lot better as well. So So yeah, we'll get into that later. One thing you mentioned is just like the size of those companies and like those big MySQL installs, but just like it's funny looking at your different stops, Heroku, Citus, and Crunchy. I imagine that like your Postgres sort of all those, but I imagine very different sort of customer profiles there, right? Like compared like Heroku, especially like that Citus one in the middle. I imagine that's a lot of like enormous installs as compared to Heroku being like more, lots of smaller ones. I'm sure some big ones as well. And then Crunchy probably more in the middle between those two. Like, am I right on that? Has the sort of customer base?
Generally, yes, right? Like we ran over 1 million databases at Heroku. The idea of like a 1 in a million problem was a once a week, right? But like we had, it was way back, right? We ran, I don't know if you remember like GroupMe or Reportive. They were like massive databases. Think through Matt. There was a bunch of way back at Heroku, like, these are multi-terabyte databases, right? And when we're talking about multiple terabytes, like, sure, it's not Facebook or Twitter scale, but like that's pretty massive. And these are transactional databases, right? Not like a news feed where it's okay if you refresh and it looks different, right? Like those are very different problems when you talk about the massive, like even Google, when you think about search results, it doesn't have to be consistent, right? It's roughly this, and there's a lot of caching and otherwise. And Citus, our average customer, I want to say, was around 10 to 40 terabytes. Our largest was 960 terabytes. So I love it when something happens on the internet and I write a blog post and it hits Hacker News and they're like, this, like, Postgres doesn't do this. And I'm like, well, I think I've been there and I've run it before and I think it can. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, at that kind of scale, it doesn't matter whether it's MySQL or Postgres, you're making trade-offs. And it works. At Crunchy, we've had actually Heroku send some of their largest customers over to us in the past few years of like, they're outgrowing the bounds of Heroku, but like super specialized, like we know how to run Postgres at scale. We've got customers at 20, 30, 40 terabytes on single node Postgres right now on Crunchy. And so it was different. Like Citus was a special purpose thing. It's fascinating. We actually just today launched official support for it on Bridge. It's not everyone needs Citus. If you do, it's pretty magic. But
are you at the point, like, do you sort of try and talk people out of Citus, or not like talk people out of it like it's a bad thing, but just like, are you push back and are just like, hey, make sure you really need Citus because there are trade-offs once you go sharded and things like that and those difficulties, or like how do you sort of approach that when people want Citus?
Yeah, I've definitely, even at Citus, we had one customer that came on board that was like 40 gigs. I'm like, you don't need this. And they were planning, like, everyone's going to be the next Facebook, right? It's like, I'm running an e-commerce for hamsters. And the scale and the market of hamsters is massive, and we're going to need petabyte scale. And it's just like, you're not, but there's a balance there of like, as a customer, right? Like, cool, I'll show you how to use it. And there's certain apps, like if you're a multi-tenant SaaS B2B app, like Citus actually drops in really well. And it just solves a lot of problems. You don't have to think it, like, you don't have to worry. But there's a lot of folks out there that are like, oh, you're not Google scale, but we're selling Google scale technology. And I'm just like, yeah, Postgres runs the TLD.org. Like the .org TLD is powered by Postgres. It all flows through.
That's wild.
And like, all right, that works. That's good enough for me. I try to be as consistent and transparent as I can over the years. Like, there's a lot of folks that are now bandwagon, like, Postgres fans that were actually talking crap about it, like, 5 years ago. It doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. What you see is what you get. Like, I think it's a good database. I think it does 90% really well. I think, like, if I'd rather not have another piece of my stack to add complexity, that's what I want. Like, if I don't have to maintain on call for a full text search system, or for my vector database, or for my graph database, and Postgres gets me 80-90% of the way there, then like I'm sleeping easier at night.
Yep. Okay, cool. I want to talk about some of those things later as well. Okay, but you mentioned, so Crunchy Bridge announced support for Citus today. Before that, was Crunchy Bridge like mostly almost exclusively single node Postgres, or did you have other mechanisms for doing sort of multi-node Postgres or sharded Postgres?
Mostly single node. We have some customers that have scaled out with like read replicas, and like Postgres will maintain its own cache for a read replica. So like It's a clever approach if you're like, I've got my, I don't know, my leads table over here, my opportunities table over here, and send all the queries to my opportunities table over here. Like Postgres will maintain a separate cache there. So it works. It's pretty simple, and it's a pretty, brute force kind of approach, but it does work pretty well. We have had some Citus customers for a while that it wasn't quite so official, but it was there. They were really savvy users. This is more of a first-class support for Citus.
Gotcha. Okay, sounds good. And so you mentioned that Crunchy sort of started out as like more support. You're the product officer there and doing more product type stuff. What sort of product offerings does Crunchy have?
So we've always had products, but it's been a little more of like the Red Hat model, right? Like I need, enterprise, like I live and breathe this open source world, right? Like I came up through Heroku, and like that's, of course, this open source ecosystem. I mean, the Django world, I feel like, is my family and home. Even though like I don't write Django these days, I don't contribute to Django, but it's like show up at, I was DMing with Simon Wilson earlier today, and like Jacob Kaplan Moss, like when he's in town, like if he's not coming over for dinner, I'm pretty annoyed at him. We were just emailing this week about something. And so like, I love that world and ecosystem, but like, that's my world and ecosystem. Where was I at?
So Crunchy product offerings, like what's that would sort of look like?
The enterprise isn't used to open source, like still today. And like, they're like, all right, we've been using Oracle, and we're going to go to this. We've heard about this Postgres thing. Okay. And they're like, we gotta like, what's our monitoring stack? What's our HA stack? What's our disaster recovery? And what they're going to do is a bake off of every single one of these products. And it's like 3 years later, they're like, all right, we're ready to deploy Postgres. And the whole landscape has changed. And I look at this and it's just like, at some level I cringe, right? I'm just like, wait, why can't you just know? Like, here's the best of breed, and you deploy this stuff. And if it doesn't work, you change it. But that's not how enterprises work. And they say, I want to trust Postgres and that I can deploy it, right? And so with Crunchy, you get trusted deployment of, Kubernetes or bare metal. And it's like, oh, I need HA, I need backups, I need disaster recovery, I need monitoring, I need connection scaling. Like, how many connection pullers are there right now for Postgres? Like, there's Odyssey, there's a new one I'm blanking on, there's PG Pool, there's PG Bouncer, there's like, each of those has serious trade-offs. And it's similar to Red Hat, right? Like, enterprise is saying, I want to run Linux. Okay, well, what flavor of Linux and how do I get support for it, right? And so that's where we were at for a lot of years, was large enterprises, large banks, public sector, all of that I want to run Postgres. We're making a strategic bet, but we need someone that can tell us what to do, give us a curated deployment. And so we started there, right? Which was still software and products, just not a like, I'm going to click a button and swipe my credit card and get a database, right? And Crunchy Bridge came to be about 3 years ago. And I joke, but it's also true that it's like unfinished business from the Heroku Postgres days. Like, Heroku Postgres, really solid, but it kind of stalled out. It's like Heroku Postgres was Postgres for Heroku. And RDS is fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but I think we can do better. And you see that from our customers that like, they ask a question and the level of support they get, if we can ship a feature before we respond to the support ticket, and that's not because we don't respond to the support ticket for like 6 months. It's like, no, we're going to respond to you tomorrow, but we're going to see if we can get this live today as a feature improvement, if it's a good feedback. Like, it's huge. And you want to ask about like shared buffers or huge pages or like what this means for like, hey, there's this weird query plan. We employed Tom Lane, who contributes he is Postgres. He's been ranked as like the top like 6, I think, contributors to all of open source. Like, he helped write TIFF, then JPEG and PNG. Like, he co-authored the spec for PNG, and then he's like, I'm bored with that. Let's work on this database system. Like, if there's a bug in Postgres, like I can get the answer to it, or it's not fixable, right?
Yeah, exactly. And just like having that sort of responsiveness and like expert knowledge on board, where it's not like you're filing a support ticket to like some like, first level support person that's going to like dither around forever, but like, it gets escalated pretty quickly and you like real experience back is just like so valuable. I feel like you're seeing that more and more, like companies that are tying together some operational and management of stuff, but also just like that wisdom that goes with it and just like making it super easy, or like helping you bridge that gap is awesome. I love it. So if I'm sort of getting started with Postgres today, like what's your sort of recommended strategy? I imagine like you want to start with a managed offering, right? There's no reason to be running Postgres yourself anymore. Is that standard advice?
I think generally, like I like, to each his own, right? If you want to like become a Postgres operator, like and futz around, sure. Like I don't think that's bad or wrong, right? Like if I were a VC, like my investment philosophy would be like, I want to go do the get shit done stack, right? It's like Rails or Django, Tailwind, and Postgres. And like I'll run it on Heroku or Render or Fly and the database on Crunchy. Like I don't want to be like doing security updates. I want to be building features, right? And like it's a super anti-pattern from a lot of developers, I think, like want to learn everything versus like I want to build products. That's my ethos. And I want to make databases easy so that you can get back to building products. If you want to learn Postgres, right? Like there's a couple of books. I think Dimitri Fontaine has one. I think it's The Art of PostgreSQL. Andy Atkinson has one that's for Rails developers. That's a great, great book that just came out. Highly recommend both. Like the biggest thing is, as a developer, don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of SQL. Like be curious, just like you are about everything else. Like we've got the Postgres Playground with Crunchy Data, which is like Postgres in your browser. One of our folks on the team went and created a like tutorial for like, maybe not elementary, maybe middle school kids, but maybe like late stage elementary. That's like, she was helping with a summer camp and wanted like kids to like, there's no cost to this. It's running in your browser. Like learn databases and how they work. We've got a ton of tutorials in there that it's like, I think the biggest thing is don't be afraid of it. Ask the question, be curious, just like you are for other things.
Yep, gotcha. And so, just going back, if I'm getting started with Postgres, I want to manage offering. Like I hear, support and things like that from Crunchy Data, but you all have like a sort of entry level offering for like an RDS or something like that, where it's like if I have a new database, I can just come and you'll totally handle that and sort of scale with me until I need more of like that support and things like that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, it starts at $10 a month. If you're like a complete like poor college student, you actually it philosophically like pains me to charge you, like I'm in the Bay Area, coffee's not cheap. Like it pains me, or avocado toast, take your pick, right? It pains me to charge you charge a credit card for $3. If your bill is less than $5 in a month, we don't charge you.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
So it's like it's not necessarily free to run continuously, right? Like I've seen enough of the like freemium world. I was at Heroku for a long time. Pricing changes were hard. It's not a good situation. Like, yeah, we're running resources under the covers. Like, there's not a free run your database all the time on us. I mean, if you're building a product, $10 a month is not crazy. If you're learning, just suspend your cluster at night, every night. And there's like an easy suspend button that like data doesn't go away, unsuspend it. Like as a student, you should be able to not pay us a penny and learn Postgres.
Cool. Okay, tell me about, I guess, like the Postgres ecosystem and just explain this to me right now. Because as I look at it, there's so much going on. There's core Postgres. Then there's this world called extensions, which includes like, sort of like add-on extensions like PostGIS or PG Vector. But then there's also like, almost like full-fledged extensions like Citus or Timescale, which is like almost a different thing. And then there's like these Postgres with like application level features, Nile, Superbase, things like that. And then there's like this Postgres compatible world of Yugabyte, Amazon Aurora, things like that. Like, I don't know if I have a question here, but like what accounts for the energy here and like what's going on in this whole ecosystem?
It's chaos, right? Postgres core and community, let's just start there, right? Like the core team, when you think of the core team as like, that's decide what happens, right? No, like the core team is like a governance body and steering committee. I think the core team is 9 right now and maybe 7. There's like, I don't think it's written, I've never read the core bylaws. I don't think it's actually in the bylaws, but there's this unspoken rule that like the core team can never be more than 50% one company. So like Crunchy has members on core team, EDB does, like when EDB acquired Second Quadrant, it was like, we're more than 50%. What do? We add people. Core doesn't determine what gets committed in Postgres. All of Postgres development happens, I would say 80-90% on the mailing list. Now there's back channels that happen, right? And there's development meetings like pgconf.dev. It used to be pgcon. I actually hate the name pgconf.dev because you think it's like, this is for developers if I want to learn Postgres. No. This is where like the Postgres hackers show up. You want to learn how like true, like it's like Linux kernel development. Like it's mailing list and like patches on the attachment, right? You get a commit bit to Postgres, you can commit something. I think there's about 50, 60 committers. I'd have to go double check that. There's also this like vague term of like major contributor, minor contributor. Doesn't really quite mean anything. It's like, you contributed a major feature. You maybe didn't even commit it. There's this kind of unspoken street cred of like, you commit something, you maintain it. I recall a couple of years ago, there's one, committer that got their commit bit, committed a whole bunch, was really excited. The whole next Postgres release, he was cleaning up bugs. Like it's not taken lightly. It takes a while to get a commit bit. I think the average age is probably 40, 45, 50, right? It's not like young upstarts. There are some younger folks there, but like it takes a while. Like the idea that, you don't need to know how like B tree or gen indexes work and this like CS academic stuff, like the whiteboard problems, actually you do to commit to Postgres.
They matter here. Yep. And is there a lot of active development and stuff happening within core Postgres? Like when I see that extension ecosystem, I wonder like how much gets pushed out to that versus like how much is core Postgres just like charging ahead and like making a ton of improvements? Is there a lot of energy in core Postgres itself?
Yeah, I mean there is. It's usually slow and steady, right? It's usually like performance improvements. Citus was pretty instrumental in like its first Citus was a fork. And they pushed to actually get like extensions, like there always has to be a hook exposed for the extension to work or not. And at first, Citus wouldn't have worked as an extension. And so Citus aggressively worked, like Marco and Andres and team to get these hooks in, right?
So they wanted to be an extension from the beginning and just couldn't, so they had to fork it until they could become it. Because I remember when they did switch from fork to extension, and that was sort of the plan and desire all along.
Yeah, it was. I don't know if it was all along, right? But it was, it wasn't a possibility on day one. Back when I was at Treviso, it was a pure fork, right? Like if you look way back, like Redshift was a fork. Redshift was par excel that Amazon basically acquired the IP and didn't hire any. Like they didn't acquire par excel. They licensed par excel and then kind of let it dry and then hired the engineers to keep doing it and then rebranded it as Redshift. There was Greenplum back in the day, Astrodata, which, part of Netezza, Treviso. There was several of these that were all forks, and that was the only option back then. Now with more and more of these hooks, now when we get into extension territory, right, there is Contrib that ships with Postgres, like HStore, some of the UAUID stuff, Trigram. There's like I forget what it is, like point stuff, like geospatial. It's like Earth distance, I think. Like there's some basic geospatial stuff. Then there's like PostGIS is massive. I wouldn't say it's the most advanced extension. It's maybe the most breadth. Like it had this weird parallel community. Like they release on their own cadence. There's their own community that like you'll see some of those folks at Postgres conferences, but also some of them not. And it's huge. Like it's well regarded as the most advanced open source geospatial database. It's like you kind of have Esri, which is high end commercial, and you have PostGIS. Like that's there's not another thing in the same ballpark.
And so what determines like so some of those things in contrib you're saying like HStore or distance, those are still extensions, but they just ship with core? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, you still got to run create extension.
Okay.
I'd have to check. I can't remember the last time something was added to contrib.
Okay. And are those just sort of like small and stable enough that, or was it just like sort of past decisions and now they're like, we're not doing that anymore. Like extensions are separate now.
I can't remember of one being added in the last 5 years. Maybe one of the UUID ones. Not sure. Yeah, I don't think we'll see a lot more contrib is my hypothesis. And I'm sure there's going to be some like committer that's like, haha, Craig, I'm going to show you wrong and I'm going to slide one in. For the most part, like PG stat segments is the one that I can best think of. That was 9.2, but it already existed. It was like a complete rewrite. Like PG stat statements before 9.2 is not the same PG stat statements that we got in 9.2, which I think is the most useful extension, hands down. It should be installed on every single database. It does have a minor performance hit. It's not like it's free. And so that's where it's like core will say, nope, we're not going to do something and make this decision for everyone.
Yep. Interesting. On this same sort of note about the committers and core and things like that, I was talking to another database guy. I don't even want to talk about say which database because I don't want to like stir up stuff, but he was kind of bemoaning his database of choice and how performance had been getting slower and slower over releases. And part of that reason he was saying is just like, hey, there's more features being added, which, benefit the few, but sort of add just slight performance regressions for the many. And he was noting that Postgres has managed to avoid that for the most part. Do you have a sense on like why that is? Like, is that your sense as well? Is that true? And like,
yeah. I mean, Postgres is slow and stable, right? Like, I mean, you mentioned Sam's comment, like, oh, it's for the operators. And it's like they layer things in. And it's like, Postgres is going to be right. Like, it's not, like, its goal is to be correct, always. Like MySQL play fast and loose with, like, the data, like, structures underneath and the storage engines. And the idea, it's like, oh, we don't need foreign keys. Like, who cares? Like, as an app developer, every single time I've encountered a database that I was like, oh, we don't have foreign keys in our database. I'm like, let me run just a few queries. I'm like, which record is correct? And they're just like, they're spending weeks cleaning. Postgres has always been, the goal is secure and correct. And then fast, right? Like, then we'll work on the fast piece. We don't need bells and whistles, right? And the extension stuff was thought about from day one. It's there's not another equivalent. Like it's not Oracle, it's not MySQL, it's not like the extension hooks are low level C hooks that gets exposed. Like, you can write to dev null, you can like create data types, you can create like all of this stuff. Like I don't know of a parallel to it. And I think like it was a bet early on. I think if Heroku hadn't bet on Postgres and it hadn't gotten adoption, I don't know Postgres would be where it is today.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's great.
Does that feel kind of wild? To like, yeah. Like, does that feel wild to be like sort of at that pivot point of that, and changing how that ended up happening?
I mean, I feel proud, lucky. It's wild. It's and I think we made the right choice. Like, I don't think there's any question of that. And I look at the likes of, the Amazons of the day that were trying to be like, no, MySQL. No, we can change it in this way and that way. Amazon Aurora Postgres took 5 years late. It shipped 5 years late. Like, they were like, no, we'll just do what we did for MySQL. I'm like, no, this isn't how engineering works. It's completely different. And so the team of Heroku Postgres, the time that I left, it was 8 of us.
You made a decide. You were talking about Redshift came out of Parcel and things like that, and that got me thinking. Like, are there sort of columnar or like OLAP style databases built on Postgres right now? I'm less familiar with that, or has it just like shifted so much to Snowflake or S3 based stuff that I guess like what's it look like for OLAP on Postgres at like those much larger scales?
I don't think you have to be at a much larger scale. I think like if I look, like we have a lot of customers doing kind of OLAP-y things on it's a different workload, right? It's lower concurrency, like different kind of planning. You can tune Postgres to do some of that. I think, Snowflake is a runaway, Snowflake kind of dominates the market right now. I think like Postgres is well primed for that. Without saying too much, like stay tuned, right? Like I have thoughts. Like I just had 3 former colleagues from Citus, like the 2 lead architects and engineers behind the Citus engineer join. Like we're cooking up some interesting things. What does that mean? Redshift is still pretty good, right? I think BigQuery is still pretty good. I don't think you actually have to go columnar these days to do data warehousing. I think like columnar is one approach and interesting, but if you look at like the landscape, like Databricks and Snowflake aren't necessarily purely columnar and operate on different kind of like file formats and data formats. That world is, that world is changing and evolving. And I think like there's not a big player right now that's a pure Postgres player. Greenplum, Redshift are the 2. Astrodata and Netezza have Postgres roots. Like if you go way back on the tree of databases, there was like Ingress, which Postgres is post Ingress. I'd have to go check. Like I think like DB2 is like there's kind of a world of Oracle based and there's a world of Postgres based. Like way back in the like 25-year history. It's fascinating. Like there's not like 23 databases that everything's derived from. It's 2. And it's like Ingress is one of those. And the name is terrible, right? Like let's just like call it Postgres. Please don't call it PostgreSQL. Like because for a while it didn't even have SQL support. I think it was like 95 that it was like, and we added like the SQL back on, and it's just a horrible naming. It's bad.
Yep. Okay. Cool. Okay. Now that we know the ecosystem, I want to change gears a little bit and look at, I guess, like some features that are offered by Postgres. And I want to basically like, should I use, should I not use, or maybe like some caveats on like, when should I not think about using, or like, where should I be worried about some of these things? So just to get a sense on like, there's just so many features, like when should I use those? So first of all, let's start off with custom data types, right? Like one of the core things about Postgres early on is like you can create your own data types. If I'm an app developer, not an extension developer, not a library, anything like that, just an app developer, should I be creating my own custom data types, or should I just use the sort of bog standard ones?
We create enums a good bit. Like, I don't know if that's quite a custom data type, right? Like but it works for some consistency. Like, on the data types topic, don't use money. Please don't. It's just a bad data type. Like, I think we have a blog post on it somewhere. It's just like, it should be removed. Just it came from a different era of like one worldview, and money and math is hard.
What should I use instead?
Decimals or numerics, like with like proper, or just ints actually, and like maintain the like they're almost anything but money basically is a better choice. I don't know that you should go crazy on your own custom data types. I do think you should use the data types Postgres has. Like, if you're doing anything with time and calendars, like range types are so amazing. Like if you're building like a university like scheduling system that 30 kids can be in the class and you can't have like range types. Oh my goodness. Check constraints are amazing when you layer them on. So use the ones that Postgres has. I don't think you need to go crazy with like, I'm going to go and invent a data type.
Yep. Okay. All right. Second one, JSONB. Should I use JSONB?
Yes.
When should I use JSONB versus like, defining different columns, or like when is JSONB a good choice?
It's probably not helpful. Like when you see it, you know it. It's like, oh, we've got this response coming back from an API, and it's sometimes it has this value, sometimes it has that value, or we like feature flags, or like if you're using that in your application, it's not crazy. Most of the time you want JSONB. Most of the time you don't want JSON. I really like JSON if you're recording, like if you're running an API and you want to record just the raw stuff, and for the most part, you're not querying it. You're not it's like, we want the raw, like we want a history of our API traffic and what hit it for the last week. And then we're just going to print it off, right? Because it's going to preserve white space, but it's way cheaper. You don't have to convert it to actual properly typed JSON. But mostly JSONB, yeah. Like as soon as you have certain columns that it's like, okay, like, org ID and team ID and customer ID and ID, like pull those out so you can easily index those. You can also index JSONB with like a gen index.
Yep. Should I be indexing my JSON? Like if I'm indexing my JSONB or querying my JSONB directly, a lot of fields in there, does that sort of signify I should split it out as separate columns, or is that still a fine pattern to?
You can still just like create a gen index. And as long as like you're querying, like, because a lot of times on JSON, it's like, it's fairly undefined, right? Like sometimes you have this column and sometimes you have this, key, and I want to know how many provision requests I got, right? And so I'm looking for like type of request of provision and like create your index on that and you're fine. It works. So I don't think you have to overly normalize. I'm actually a fan of denormalization. Like in multi-tenant apps, like where you have like customer ID or org ID, put that on every single table, please.
Okay. What about full text search?
Yeah, use it. It's not great internationally. Like it's general, like, if you need to load in, like, then you've got to kind of have access to the server to load in the new, like, the language or I forget what the actual official name is. But basically, you've got to, like, load that in. It's not great on a managed service if they don't support it, right? It's still really good. Like, it's like, instead of, like, running Elastic, I've got a friend that's going to ping me as soon as he hears this. He's like, no, Craig, this is so much faster. Use this, and it's so much better. Yes, it's faster. Yes, it's better. And now I get woken up for 2 systems at night.
Yep. And like Elastic is like, I always say this, but it's like the system that scares the crap out of me the most operationally. Like it's just a different beast, I think Elastic is. So I like to avoid it where possible, but
it's fast. It's good. It's not a bad system. I've got a good friend that runs like an Elastic as a service. And like I appreciate him doing that. But I'm with you. I don't want to be woken up for Postgres, much less Elastic, right? When it's like, we actually accidentally triggered a complete reindex of our cluster and we're down for 2 hours. Like, that's Elastic for you. And so should I, like, is it like, hey, full text search is fine to do on like a last name column, but you shouldn't do it for like a larger blobby, bunch of text? Or is it fine to do on larger blobby bunches of like user input and things like that? You're fine with that as well? Totally works. And it's really, what's your constraints and use case? And, like, are we talking about like a 100 gig database? Like, go to town, right? Like, I'm used to, like, the largest Postgres database I've run was 960 terabytes. Like, how much storage do you have on your, like, really nice MacBook, right? Like, not, like, this is all a matter of size and scale and magnitude. Like, yeah, I mean, a terabyte, 2 terabytes, like, fine, go for it.
Okay. What about row level security?
It's great. It's not overly used as much as I've seen. I've actually, I've got a blog post that I'm like about to publish on like using row level security for like multi-tenant apps to enforce policies. There's a bit of a balance there of like with PG Bouncer, which everyone should use PG Bouncer. And when you're now doing like transaction level like pooling, which is how you should run it, like, okay, how do we manage session, like in between sessions and all that? PG Bouncer just got a lot better with like transaction pooling, and some of the stuff from the Citus team and what they contributed. So it's like way better now. Like RLS works great. I mean, it's kind of a defense in depth view, right? Like, do you need it or not? And I actually see it more valuable in multi-tenant apps than like, you don't want to give every database user out to, like, you don't want to reconnect with a new user to enforce RLS. You want to like create the policies at the app level.
Yep. Yeah. The area I see it the most now would be like with Supabase, where they actually are having client side users connect directly to a database. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah. I mean, at scale, like you just can't manage that many connections. Like that's a new connection to your database, and 500 users or 1,000, like, I mean, I'm running databases that they have, hundreds of thousands of concurrent users. I don't even want to think about that. My colleague, like Stephen Frost, is actually the one that like contributed RLS. And it's funny because I was talking with him about the whole like multi-tenant stuff, and he's like, yeah, actually that works pretty well. I'm like, you didn't think about that when you were like, it's like, yeah, this works fine. It's like, yeah, it's very security minded, right? I don't know that I would I would go and give it out to like end users because now I'm managing how many users connect into my database.
Yep, absolutely. What about stored procedures? Should I use stored procedures?
Man, I'm not anti them. I had an email from someone like 9 months ago, like, cold email, like talking about stored procedures. We got on a call and he's like, yeah, like tell me, Craig, like tell me like how have we solved the testing story and deployment story? I'm like, we haven't. I'm sorry. Like, how do you roll out version 1 versus version 2 when roll back? Like all the things that we get with GitHub and deployment and CI and CD, it's not there. One of our customers that's a big personal budgeting app. Like you may use it, like you'd know it. I don't know if I can name them or not. But like,
I think I saw it on the website. So is it Wine App?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, it's not our website, so I'm not getting in trouble with marketing then. I have to be careful in who I get in trouble with. Yeah, like, I mean, they, it's a great budgeting app. I ran their database back in Heroku. They came over to us. They have a ton of like stored procedures that do the computations and the recalculations of your budget. And like, I love you guys. Man, I actually don't think I want to like come work for you and manage that app. But like, there's this like, how do you version and test? And it takes a certain type that you really got to be comfortable with SQL. So I wouldn't be like all in on stored procedures. I do think the pendulum swung too far, where it's like, no, databases are dumb. Don't put logic in them. I think we swung too far away from that. Like the idea of like, well, how about foreign key constraints and check constraints? Like, let's at least have some integrity in the database. I don't know that I'm fully back to like, let's put all the logic back in the database.
Yep. Be pretty judicious, pretty limited with it, but a few things can be kind of nice for you there. Okay. What about listen, notify?
It's okay. It's fine. I wouldn't, do you need to guarantee delivery? Because like, if you're not listening, it didn't notify, right? As a cheap kind of queue approach, I don't think Postgres is a great database for a queue yet. It can be done if you're really good about it. And as a graph database, there's options, there's approaches. I don't know that I'm like, yeah, you're using Postgres, you should definitely do that. Geospatial? Yeah, for sure. Full text search? Yeah, for sure. JSON? Yes. Vector? Yes. Like P2 vector's good. But I don't know that I'm like, yeah, as a queue or as a like graph database, I don't know that I'm quite, no brainer.
Yeah, gotcha. For graph, is there an extension that people use for graph, or is it mostly like, hey, how you're modeling your data and then, the queries you're writing and things like that, or like how are people, or is just like not that many people using Postgres as a graph right now?
There is an extension. It was Aiken's graph, and they may have rebranded. I think it's part of the Apache Foundation. Every time it comes up, I get asked about it. And I'm like, I've never heard of someone using it in the wild. So I mean, it's like I can't say like Craig, you follow everything Postgres, you've seen it all, and I'm like, I haven't seen that in the wild. Not to say it's not out there, not to say there's not people using it. I haven't come across it at all.
Yeah, I think there are just like fewer graphy problems than people think too. Like a lot of them, people I think overreach for graphs sometimes and don't understand how to model it. And it's like a lot of that could work in just like a sort of standard database without all the graphy stuff. So
I mean, if it was 12, 18 months ago, and we were still at the NFT like heyday, then maybe, right? Like that's clearly a graph problem is what it is. I don't know a bunch of other problems that fit into that territory.
Yeah, absolutely. What about sort of outside of Postgres, but ORMs? Are you pro ORM, anti ORM, somewhere in the middle?
Somewhere in the middle, right? Like my favorite ORMs are not the mainstream ones. It's not active record. Like SQL in the Ruby world is a really nice ORM. I like SQL Alchemy over the Django one. Like it's just a slightly better, and it also makes it easier to drop down to raw SQL. So I love, within the Django world that it's getting support for Postgres native things like range types, like JSONB. Like I love that the ORMs are not like, oh, we're just going to treat all databases equally, and SQLite has the same data types as Postgres. Like man, the discussions and arguments I had with Django core people, I'm like, And all of them ran Postgres anyways. And they're like, no, but we're going to be equal to MySQL and exactly how we support. So I do love that ORMs have kind of like jumped into embracing databases. My favorites, like SQL for the Ruby world is a really good ORM. SQL Alchemy and what Mike does like for that is really, really awesome. So fan of those. I can't speak as much to like the Node world or the Java world. I know most of the others are a little bit better.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, and just like sort of on all these features, the article I always think of, I don't know if you know Nelson Elhaj. I think he used to work at Stripe, and he just had a really good post once about just like how he likes relational databases, SQL, and all that stuff. But the problem being they're just like so many features, and it's hard to tell which ones are going to scale well and which ones aren't. I guess like, do you have that worry, or are you just sort of like, explore the studio space? It sounds like you sort of like the features of a relational database, and probably just not that many people run into that space where they're going to have the scale problem that comes up.
Yeah, it's a lot less than you think, right? And yeah, I mean, how much can I say on Stripe? Like Stripe created a lot of interesting, like Stripe's fascinating company and great engineering. But I like Brunder, who works on our API team, like, talk in depth of like working with this and that. And like, why did we create this problem or that problem? Right. And you're building products. You're not necessarily making the best technology decision. Postgres works really well and it scales really far. And like, if you get to Stripe scale and like, oh, this feature doesn't work at that scale. Guess what? Stripe has the engineers and the resources to then like try it 5 different ways. Like, if you get to that point, you've won, right? They're different problems. I haven't ran into many problems where I'm like, oh man, Postgres just fell over at this scale.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I want to ask a few questions that are, I'd say like maybe like responding to naysayers, like some of the things you maybe hear people naysay about Postgres, and just get sort of your opinion on. One of them you already alluded to, like in I would say like the right amplification issue that like Uber mentioned in their sort of Postgres to MySQL post. I think like Andy Pavlo kind of talked about it in his like least favorite thing about Postgres was something about their MVCC and the right amplification. I guess like, do you see that being a big issue, the right amplification issue with Postgres?
In extreme cases, I mean, it's not like it doesn't exist, but you've got to be really pushing crazy. And I think there were like trade-offs and other approaches like Uber could have made. Right? Like Uber came in with someone, there was a new VP of engineering that said, I know MySQL. MySQL doesn't have this problem. We're migrating to MySQL, right? A very blunt force. Like, yeah, and I can go and point to 10 databases that are at larger scale than Uber that run Postgres fine. So I think it's, if you don't like the tool that you got and you want to change to something you're more familiar with, great. The Z heap and other approaches to some of that, like they've been explored and thought about, you take it a long enough approach, we wake up in 5 years or 10 years, it's a solved problem in Postgres, right? If you're worried about that problem today, okay, maybe Postgres isn't right for you, but like you're making other trade-offs. What are those other trade-offs?
What about connection management? That's another one I hear as well. What's sort of the state with that? Like, are we just like in hey, you need a sort of a connection pool outside of Postgres and that's how it's going to be? Or do you think we'll get some improvements in core?
I still always recommend running PG Bouncer. Like I just do. Like it's not a bad thing. I see applications drop it in and it's the biggest free lunch that I've ever seen in running a database. Postgres 14 got some pretty massive, like in large thanks to Andres. Andres was a coworker at the time at Citus. I would sit there and debate him and be like, Craig, you're wrong. And he ran a like in-depth benchmark and he's like, okay, maybe you're not as wrong as I thought. And like huge improvements, like connection management in Postgres 14 and on, way better. Like thousands of connections, not a problem. Still, why not run with PG Bouncer? It's an amazing connection puller. Like to me, that was a no-brainer to ship. Like, I wouldn't allow us to ship Crunchy Bridge without it. I'm like, every database as a managed service should have built-in connection pooling because it is a weak spot in Postgres. And we shipped it on day one, and I think like there's still like major database providers today that don't have it. I'm just like, you got to do better if you're a managed service. So It got way better in Postgres 14. I think it has a worse rap right now than it should, but I would still run with one.
Gotcha. What about, operationally, you all are handling PG Bouncer for folks. How hard is PG Bouncer operationally? And just thinking back to, the two systems you're talking about, Elasticsearch and Postgres, like if people are not using Crunchy Bridge and they're like, hey, do I really want to pull on PG Bouncer and that maintenance burden? Is that an easy thing to maintain? Is that a hard thing operationally?
It's pretty straightforward and easy. It works pretty well. I would say like there's not an easy HA mechanism for it. So you do kind of need some monitoring and that sort of thing. It's not like Postgres HA is, I want to say solved because it doesn't ship. Like Postgres doesn't ship with HA and you got to grab something off the shelf. Like, it's why people pick up in like the enterprises called Crunchy. It's like, okay, what do I need for HA? Right. But you don't have to go like, oh man, what are the options? Do they exist? PG Bouncer is pretty resilient. It's not falling over. There's a lot of new ones that I get questions about. I can't say like operationally how those look. I'd be more skeptical. PG Bouncer has been around for a long time and it generally works.
Yeah. Okay. Is that the most used? Well, that's what y'all are using, you said at Crunchy?
It's that or PG Pool. Like PG Pool, I am much more a fan of like the Linux philosophy, like small sharp tools do one thing and really well, right? Like I don't want my editor to be like my, like my text editor to also be like my image editor. Like, no, like I want this thing to do this thing really well. PG Bouncer does that. PG Pool is also a lot of other like read, write, load balancing, and extra proxy, other things, which is a little more magic than I like for my taste. So we run PG Bouncer just like right out of the box for you on Bridge.
What about transaction ID wraparounds, vacuums, just that whole area? Is that still a big problem in Postgres? Like, are vacuums a pain or is that fairly easy?
Vacuum is fundamental how Postgres works. And people are like, look, vacuum's taking time. Let me turn it off. Postgres is an append-only log. Like when you do an update, it doesn't go and change a record. It says, this one's dirty. Let me write a new one, right? Now, that's a gross oversimplification, but like that's what it is, right? When you delete a record, it doesn't go and delete a file. It says, hey, you can reuse this space, right? And vacuum then comes back later and says, oh, now you can actually reuse this space. For the most part, tune vacuum and you're good, right? Auto vacuum will run. It's good. Transaction ID wraparound, not a bad idea to monitor it, but it's not monitor it if you're a busy database and busy application, and you are, right? Like the e-commerce hamster shop, you're not. But if you're a busy database, monitor for transaction ID wraparound and you're pretty safe. It's and there is some work in Postgres to make this like less of an issue instead of 32-bit, 64-bit. Like it's getting better. It's improving. It gets a lot more noise than it probably should.
Yeah. And I feel like I haven't heard a story on it for a while. It seemed like for a while, every 6 months or a year, someone would talk about how they had a transaction wraparound issue. I feel like it's been a couple of years since I've heard somebody do that. So maybe there's just been like enough, word and knowledge about it that people are aware of it and monitoring it better and not hitting it. But
we had one customer recently that hit not a transaction ID wraparound, but an ID exhaustion. So their like primary keys were just like int32. You're like, we're out. And so, and that's like the ORM layer, right? Like that's not like a, Postgres thing. It's like you created this and this is the key space. And there's actually a really clever trick of like, all right, go negative. Like reset your sequence back down to like negative, 5 billion. And now let's change, like, let's gradually change this column type, right? Or write a new column. So it's like, oh yeah, here's the fail-safe escape hatch, which works really well.
Yep. Oh, that's interesting. All right, last one on sort of naysayers. Transactional DDL is something that Postgres has, and I believe MySQL doesn't. But one thing I hear some people say is like, hey, that's more of a toy feature, like something you wouldn't use in production. Like, do you use transactional DDL? Do you recommend it?
Yeah, all the time. Like, if you're running a migration and it fails midway, like, I actually don't even know what happens on the like half your tables have this column, half your records have this column, half don't. It's actually a pain because you can't concurrently create an index with transactional DDL, right? Because it's a transactional thing. I always recommend concurrent index creation because it basically runs 2 to 3 times slower, but it's in the background, right? It doesn't hold a lock on the table. I think like MySQL only grew the capability recently to like not hold a lock while you add an index. I'm just like, the idea that like operationally that's okay blows my mind. Of like, what do you do then?
That seems really, that seems really hard to be like, yeah, exactly. What do you do? That seems pretty wild to me.
And so like, yeah, transactional DDL is wonderful. Like, oh, it blew up. Okay, great. Like, let's roll that back, right? Like, I wanted to write all these columns out and it couldn't. I'd like, to be fair, I haven't operated MySQL in more than 15 years, right? But I'm around the space enough that like, I'm sure like there's some like, yeah, this is the playbook for every operator of MySQL and what you do. And here's the like hack that works around it. Postgres just works. Like transactional DDL is amazing. Like, why wouldn't you want it?
Yep. Cool. Okay. I just want to close out with some common questions. These are 6 questions that we just ask all our guests, just get a feel on some of this stuff and see where they're at. So sort of rapid fire, but if you could master one skill that you don't currently have, what would it be? Can be tech, can be non-tech, whatever you want.
I don't know. Actually, maybe like better at fishing. Like I grew up in Alabama. Like I grew up on a bass boat. I don't know that I ever like became good at it. So maybe that like just like the idea of retiring from tech and like being on a boat and fishing all day is lovely. Except for I'd like to actually like consistently catch prize fish. So maybe completely like off the radar that.
It's funny because you're probably like top 1% in the world already at that, because like how many people don't do bass fishing at all, but now you just like to be significantly better at it.
It's that, or like, I mean, if I were to like completely swap jobs, like I don't actually want to swap jobs, but like a like world class like tiki bartender like that, I would do that.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, what wastes the most time in your day?
Kids. Don't like I love my kids. Don't have kids. Like no yeah like people are like, what's your hobbies? I have kids. I don't have
kids,
hobbies.
Exactly. What ages are the kids right now?
11 and 8. So I'm like counting the day till like I'm really looking forward to when they go off to college because I want to like retire and then like show up at their campus, like their college campus at like Thursday and be like, hey, we're going to dinner tonight, and completely embarrass them. That's what I want to be that dad.
There you go. Nice. If you could invest in one company that's not the company you work for, what would it be? Ideally private company, because otherwise you could just invest in them. So,
I mean, I feel like I'd be like, I want to be a VC of the make money companies, which is like the Rails chain. Like that's what I would do, right? It's not like one. It's like I want to find the companies that are not using this shiny new database that came out last year, that are using Postgres, that are using Tailwind and Django or Rails. And like that's your tech stack, like that's how I'm going to invest.
That's your filter. Yeah.
You tell me that you're like, I'm working on this distributed database, this, that, like, nope. Like you're going to be working for 3, like that's what I would like. I'd go bug Jason Warner and other friends and like, all right, pull our money. Like the boring VC sounds fun.
There you go. That's a great name. Would you ever want to be a VC, or do you like sort of building product too much?
I like building teams. I like operating. If you asked me 8 years ago, I thought maybe. I like operating and building teams, and teams that execute really well. Being part of the Heroku team, every one of us there felt like we were an imposter. Like we didn't belong. Like the way we leveled each other up was unbelievable. That collection of talent will never exist again. Citus was good, not the same. Crunchy is getting closer to that, like that level of talent, that like people filling in and growing that team. And there's a lot of, I like high growth places. It's not always perfect. It's not always pretty. It's not always easy or fun. I guess I'm getting old and soft, and like it can be a marathon. You can build great teams without like, rolling over people. And so I'm excited for what we're building. Maybe I'm getting old and soft, that it's like, it's not a, grind to like wear everyone down and prove you're smarter. It's like we're all on the same team. But like growing teams is really fun, and building products, and like, man, it's fun giving good customer support. Like when's the last time you were like, I love like, have you called up United lately or Hilton? And like, you're like, oh man, I got to deal with this. I mean, if we don't give good support to our customers, our team will hear about it from me. And it's refreshing to be able to like actually deliver that.
I agree. I used to work for a dev tools company, and it was so rewarding to like help people with their problems, and it's just like help people that you care about because you're like in the same position as them. You get what they're doing. Like, oh man, it's so much fun to be working for like a dev tool companies.
As much as I'm like a rusty old, like I'm not a proper developer anymore. Like I like to think like I joke that like maybe in middle America I could keep up, like in the Bay Area where it's like hustle and bustle. Like no, I'm not even passing grade, but it's like yeah, developers are my people as much as like usually that's my threat to the engineers is like, hey, when's this going to production? They're like, it'll be ready when it's ready. I'm like, don't worry, I'll push it. No, Craig, it'll be done tomorrow. Usually that's my threat now because my coding ability's just fallen off. But like, yeah, it's so rewarding to like we're all builders and to like deliver and support builders is fun.
Just going off track, you mentioned that Heroku team, and you had said earlier it was like 8 people. How many have you worked with any of those 8 again, or just like what's that relationship with? Do you stay in touch with them? I imagine that it's like a pretty tight knit group, just being sort of the trial by fire of that group.
Yeah, and so I ran a number of teams at Heroku. Most of my time was with the Postgres teams. When I left the Postgres team was 8 people. When I joined Heroku, it was like we were like 25 people in total. So it was a small team. We employ 10 former Heroku people right now at Citus. Some of those I worked with then. Some of those I just knew over the time. Like it's a small, like the tech world is a small incestuous world. Like Heroku and GitHub were almost the same company. Like there was a lot of people that went back and forth between the two companies. So it's a small, tight knit, and I'm always happy to add to it. Right. My goal is never like I only want to hire from ex Heroku people. It's like diversity of thought, diversity of folks, all of that matter. But it's a close knit. I think there's 4 or 5 ex Heroku people that all live within a mile from me, and I think we're like getting lunch tomorrow. So it's a small fun time.
Okay, back to the questions. Which tool or technology can you not live without besides Postgres?
I hate it, but Twitter.
Okay, you're one of those. Yeah.
I posted a picture of my Halloween decorations like 3 months ago, and someone shot me an email like, oh my goodness, Craig, I just realized you live down the street. I've been following you for 5 years. And it's like, hey, is this weird? Can we like grab a coffee or a beer? I'm like, this is not like the world's small. And I think Twitter, like I've run into so many people that just like that, like truly never be shy of dropping me a note, an email. Like, if I don't get back, I'm sorry, I just missed it. Like, don't be afraid to bug me. It's a small world, and people are what make this fun. And Twitter is, I don't know if Blue Sky is next or whatever, but that's the one that to me is kind of like changes how we think about this. And it's not transactional, right? It's relationships.
I totally agree. Like I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, and there's just like not a tech scene here, and like all my friends are on Twitter, and it's just like I see them at a few conferences a year, but other than that, it's all Twitter, and it's just like amazing how much it flattens it, and you can just like connect with anyone. So yeah, I agree. I still love it. Which person influenced you the most in your career?
That's a good question. I don't know. There's one person. I've learned from a lot of folks. Like one of my when I first started, like I grew up in Alabama, went to school in Alabama. You kind of get job offers in like Birmingham and Nashville and Atlanta, and Accenture had R&D group. It was like Accenture's like 200,000 people. Their R&D group is 160 people worldwide. And they flew me to Chicago to interview. One of my professors had some connection, and I interviewed in Chicago. And the job offer was for California. I'd never been to California in my life. And Chicago's like, well, if you don't want them, we do. And the partner at Accenture's like, no, I got dibs. And like he wanted me to go right around. Like Sanjay Mathur was amazing and like a great partner and manager. And I think a lot of people kind of joined and were there for 3 and 4 and 5 and 7, 10 years. And I was there for 2. And I think he kind of like, I don't think now he begrudges me for kind of moving on to the startup scene and actually getting to a startup and all that. I learned a lot from bad managers and bad bosses. I don't know. I mean, at Heroku, Adam Wiggins, Adam Wiggins, I absolutely loved reporting to and working for. Adam, the way he studied things, I can't say enough about Adam Wiggins as he viewed software engineering as a craft and an art, and not from a, like, this is how I should do it, but like, this is how I get better at it and am perfect at it. And when he started writing launch announcements, James had started to like do less with Heroku. James was kind of the big marketing launch person at Heroku, one of the founders. And Adam went back and read every one of James' launch posts, like from a scientific perspective of how do I write a blog post? Like, a lot of people are like, I want to write a blog post in my own voice. And like, no, he like studied what worked and what didn't, looked at views, looked at tone of voice, looked at like opening. It was a work of art. And so like Adam would take a thing that he didn't understand and learn it to the nth degree if he hired you for this role so that he could better kind of work with you. And so I think Sanjay Mathur, Adam Wiggins were a couple of folks. I mean, I had a whole lot of amazing managers at Heroku, Peter Van Hardenberg, or Untitled. Like, I kind of had I was lucky, I don't know how, like a who's who of like people that were amazing at Heroku as managers. So there's not one person, but I definitely try to like take tidbits along the way. Even the bad ones I've learned plenty from, exactly what not to do. I think I've been pretty lucky in my career of like stumbling from point A to point B. I think now I feel pretty confident in my skills. Like, for a while, a lot of imposter syndrome, like, all right, I've done this a few times over. I actually think I know what I'm doing, and it's weird. It's really weird. But there's a lot of folks in there that I like a lot of credit to.
Yeah. Well, Heroku is just so influential on a lot of areas. Like you mentioned earlier how, it probably changed Postgres trajectory, but just like the 12-factor app and just Git push Heroku master, that whole workflow and just like what came out of that. Truly an influential place, and cool that you were there for that.
Yeah, it's one that it's really funny that like there's mixed opinions on like VC culture on was it a success or failure, because it didn't make that, like, although it was acquired for a crazy multiple. I don't think I can share that, but like a lot of people actually have opinions on Heroku without knowing the details, and it's a pretty fascinating, like, that's a whole other one, another story.
Yeah, well, it definitely had an impact on, a lot of other folks outside of the VC world, and whatever that result ended up being, definitely had a lot of impact on a lot of folks. Cool. Yeah, last one. So AI being hot right now, people worried about P-doom or AI doom. What's your probability that AI equals doom for the human race?
AI is interesting. I want more of it in my life. I don't want to start giving database support via AI. Maybe it works when I'm getting started and building, how does JavaScript work? And I'm building, I feel like a washed up developer these days because I'm used to jQuery, and they're like, oh, we need a state machine for our front end. I'm like, what state? You click a button and it's clicked or it's not. I'm not a front end developer anymore these days. But I look and I don't want AI driven support for us. I want amazing people driven support. That said, right? Hey, can I write 2 sentences and have AI, elaborate on the extra prose? I think it's interesting and valuable, and we shouldn't ignore it and try to brush it under a rug. But it's, where do we apply it? How do we apply it? If it's a support system and I'm paying for support, I don't want your AI. And that's my maybe contrarian view, is there's a huge boom of look, here's the AI tool for your database and automatically writing SQL. And I'm telling my team to think about it. What's it mean for you? But at the end of the day, I think we're a ways off is my take. But there's a lot of speculation on the space, and I'm not an expert for sure. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I remember last year, early last year, thinking holy smokes, am I going to be writing code at all in 3 years? And we're sort of traveling along the hype cycle and all that sort of thing. You can tell it's not quite there, and who knows where it's going to get. But yeah, I agree with you in a lot of ways there. Craig, thanks for coming on. Like, just one last thing. I think you changed like a lot of just like how developer advocacy. I don't want to say like developer advocacy stuff, but just like the way you sort of wrote on Postgres was super helpful. I know like for me personally, like I do a lot with DynamoDB. One of the most important things I ever did was like publish this thing called DynamoDB Guide. I spent like a whole Christmas on it, and it was like a replica of Postgres Guide, which you had done before. And it was just like this, you know, and it was super helpful to me. And like, I'm grateful for you being out there and like being a role model and influence and just like all the work you've done to help a lot of people. So thank you for that. Thanks for coming on the show. Like it's been awesome to talk with you and thanks for doing this.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, it actually means like, I'd probably do it even if no one read it, but it's like, you know, like the impact, it's like, I do this, I joke that I do it because I'm lazy, but it's like, look, but it's how do I scale myself? Right. How do I like, I've been really lucky. And so like, it's a tiny way to give back to like, I enjoy what we do. And as developers, like it's kind of a fun life. And so, yeah, thanks for the kind words and reading and, you know, the Postgres promotion.
Yep, absolutely. If people want to find more about you or Crunchy Data, where should they go?
I definitely subscribe to the Crunchy Data newsletter, Postgres Weekly. I used to curate. I do a lot less with it. It's a great kind of Postgres resource. Craig Kerstiens on Twitter, craigkerstiens.com. On my personal blog, I write a little more about like startups and things now than I do about actual Postgres. The Crunchy Data blog is a wealth of information about Postgres. So if you're like, I didn't know this about Postgres and I want to learn more, like come check out the Crunchy Data resources. We've got a ton of them. I'm generally pretty easy to find. Craig Kerstiens. Even if you butcher my last name searching for it, you probably find me on the internet.
Cool. Sounds good. We'll link all those in the show notes, and I can vouch for the Crunchy Data blog. You guys had a great post yesterday on like distributed Postgres and the different sort of framework for thinking through those. That was really helpful, I thought. And go check those out. But otherwise, Craig, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.